We're here in the middle of Sadi Yevamot Beis, and the Mishnah says, Ben Tesha v'chulei v'yom echad shabal yevimto. So Reuven died, and his wife fell to Yibum to his two brothers, one of which was a Ben Tesha, we'll call it Shimon. And then Mishahigdil Nasa Ishacher. So this Shimon, who's a Ben Tesha, had a bias Yibum, so to speak, quasi Yibum, with the Yevamot of his late brother Reuven. And now, when he becomes a gadol, he goes ahead and he marries another woman, a second woman. And then he dies. Now, now his two wives fall for Yibum to Levi. Now let's keep in mind that one of those two wives, the one that was Ba'aleha, that he had relations with when he was Ben Tesha, she still has some sort of a zikas yibum back to Reuven. Whereas the woman that Shimon married when he became a gadol, that's a full-fledged marriage. And with the death of Shimon, the zikas yibum now to, we'll call him Levi, is through Shimon. So Levi now has a double relationship with this Yevamot. On the one hand, she was Ashes Reuven. And on the right, so let's put it this way. There are two Yevamots, right? There's Shimon's Aze Yibum when he was Baal as a Ben Tesha. Then there's his other wife, who was a regular Ishto. And when these two fall for Yibum, then it's really a zika of Shnei Yevamot, right? There's a projection of a zika from Reuven, because Shimon's kinyan with one of those two wives was not a full-fledged kinyan, which means that she goes back to the zika from Reuven. And then his second wife is a zika from Shimon, because he was married to Shimon after Shimon became a gadol. So it would seem that these two women who are coming for Yibum are coming through two different brothers, through Reuven and through Shimon. However, it would seem that on a D'Rabbanan level, if we Midrabbanan recognize the validity of Shimon's bia with, we'll call her Rachel, when he was a Ben Tesha. And of course, we have to recognize the full-fledged kinyan issues of Shimon with Leah, whom she married when he was already a gadol. So to some extent, we have a Zika Shnei Yevamim situation. Meaning the woman, we'll call her the Rishona Rachel, is now being projected to Yibum to Levi through both Reuven, and that's on a Doraisa level, because Shimon Dibum is worthless on a Doraisa level. He's not a Bar Yibum. On a D'Rabbanan level, he is a Bar Yibum. And Shimon's Zika to Rachel now projects Rachel from Shimon. So Rachel, is being projected from both Reuven and Shimon. And that's called Zika Shnei Yevamot. So therefore, Harishona choletzes v'lo misyabenes. So Rachel, as we called her, needs chalitza, because on a deraisa level, she's falling for Yibum to Levi from Reuven, and we just skip over Shimon. But on the other hand, Yibum becomes impossible because Rachel is being projected also, at least on a D'Rabbanan level, from Shimon, because we're going to recognize the validity of Shimon's Yibum, in quotation marks, when he was a Ben Tesha. Now, As far as Leah is concerned, that's Shimon's other wife that he married when he was a gadol, she falls for Yibum as a result of Shimon's death. And the Zika being projected from Shimon onto Levi is a regular, full-fledged, healthy Zika, independent, and therefore Choletzes Ovis Yabemis, either option is fine. The Gemara now asks the following question. V'yasu bias bentesha kimaymar begadol. The Gemara now, based on its sugya earlier on Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis, in a case of the Balas HaMaymar, we have a Gemara that formulates the following principle, that the Balas HaMaymar is Eino Misyabemis, no Yibum to a Balas HaMaymar. She received Maymar, and that excludes Yibum. She's excluded from Yibum. Why? Because there too we're going to apply that principle called Zika Shnei Yevamot. Because on a Deraisa level, the Maymar is nothing. So we're back to the original Zika from Reuven, the first husband who died. But on the other hand, Maymar creates a quasi Ishus Derabanan, such that if the Balas HaMaymar now would be subject to Yibum, it would be a Yibum from two different Zikos. And he writes here, Shabalas HaMaymar milvad masha eina misyabemes lefisha yesh aleh zikas shnei Yevamot. That's number one. So it's almost as if a woman is married to two different brothers, and simultaneously those two brothers are projecting a zikas yibum. Now, this woman, the Balas HaMaymar, has a tzara. And the halacha is that the Zika Shnei Yevamim woman, if you want to call her Rachel, she also excludes her tzara from Yibum. We'll call her Leah. In other words, Leah is now a tzara of a Zika Shnei Yevamim, and she's excluded. And therefore, if we plug this into our Mishnah, then the woman, we called her Leah, who was married by Shimon when Shimon became a gadol, she is now the tzara to a Shnei Yevamim situation, meaning we said that Rachel's status is that of Zika Shnei Yevamim, insofar as the Bia of Shimon as a Bentes does create a quasi-Ishus, on a level, and therefore now Leah becomes the tzara of a Zika Shnei Yevamim. She should therefore be completely rejected from Yibum. And that's the Gemara's objection. So in the language here, he says, Tidche, there should be an act of pushing away from Yibum. Who's going to do this tidche? It's the Eishes Harishon. Shaleh ba hakatan. That's the woman we called Rachel, who had a quasi yibum with a bia of a bentes of Shimon. She should now, this Rachel, push away the tzara, which is Leah, who's Leah, who is the Eishes hakatan she hiskadel, right? She became the wife of Shimon after he became a gadol. And now she, that Sarah, the second wife, so to speak, of Shimon, we call the Leah, should now be a tzara of Zika Shnei Yevamim. She should therefore be excluded. Omar Rav, Lo asu bias bentesha k'maimer begadol. We don't equate, the premise underlying this kasha at the Gemara is that we should equate bias bentesha, that creates a quasi-yibum on issues, to a maimer. But that far we're not going to go. In Dargis, the issues of a bias bentesha biyavimto is not the same as maimer biyavimto. And therefore, the status of Bias Pentesha is not enough of an Ishus to reject the Tzara, to push her out of the circle of Yibum V'chalitza. So she herself, the Balas Bias Pentesha, who we called Rachel, she herself is excluded for Yibum on a Drabbana level because she has this status of Zika Shnei Yevamot. But her Tzara is not going to be excluded, it's not going to be prohibited based on the status of the so-called Zikas Shnei Yevamim of the Bias Kat. So again, the status of Leah, the second wife of Shimon, the wife from Gadus, is not that of a Tzoras Bala Zika Shnei Yevamim that would generate an Isa. So she's in the parsha of Yibum. And that's because the Bias Pentesha doesn't match up to the level, and it doesn't equal that of Maimer. Shmuel Amar Asu v'Asu, Bias Ben Katan equals Maimer Begadol. And we're going to view Midrabanan as if it created an Ichus and a Yibum, just like we did in the case of Maimer. But therefore, we have the question, what about the Tzara? And V'chein Omer Rabbi Yochanan Asu v'Asu. So Bias Ben Katan equals Maimer Begadol, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. And now V'Yasu, if we upgraded Bias Ben Katan, Pentesha, to that of Maimar, then in the light of that equation, the Tzara should be Asura, and yet our Mishnah says that the Tzara is Muteris Yame, that Leah will fall for Yibum, and there'll be, full-fledged sanction and support for Yibum. Why isn't she a Tzaras Balas Maimar, so to speak, a Tzaras Balas Zika Shnei Yevamim, which in this case is the Bias Pentesha. Maritis Tanoi. This depends on a machlokas tanoim, which goes down to a grassroots problem, an issue of Maimar. Why is it that after Maimar, the Yavam is not allowed to be miyabit? I mean, you would think that after Savalas Maimar, on the contrary, maybe she should fall for Yibum. And there should be a mitzvah of Yibum, because Maimar is like one step in the process towards Yibum. It's creating each, it's bringing her closer there. We're going to have a fundamental machlokas tanoim between our Mishnah, again, the way we're analyzing our Mishnah, in the case of Eventes, whose bia in Yibum is the same status as Maimer, together against a Mishnah in a parak called Arba Achim. And Hachtana, the Arba Achim, that Tana has a whole different understanding of Maimar and why Maimar sets up a problem which not only excludes the Baal Maimar but also Hatzara. And according to the Tana of Perek Daled Achim, the reason for the Chachamim establishing that a Baal Maimar Eina Misyabem, she's excluded from Yibum, is not the way we understood it until now, that she's considered like, Eshes Shnei Mason. Okay, so let's think about this concept called Eshes Shnei Mason. What happens is that with Maimar, she now becomes connected to, with a quasi again, to the Yavam who did the Maimar. She's also connected on the Raisa level to the original deceased Ach. So she's being projected for Yibum by two different Mason. In effect, when let's say if the Baal Maimar would die. So that's called Eshes Shnei Mason. And we thought that that's the reason why the Baal Maimar is Eina Misyabem, she's excluded from Yibum. Again, this Tana Dalarachim is going to reject that. He's going to come up with an alternative explanation as to why the Baal HaMaimer is Edom Misyabemis. Now, the reason why the Tana of Perek Dalarachim rejects that understanding of Eisha Shnei Mason is because, as explained here by the various commentaries, because on a Doraisa level, there is no such entity. There's no Metzius of Eisha Shnei Mason. It cannot be. Now, to explain that, when does Eisha Shnei Mason come into the fore? That's in a case, as the Gemara explains in Gittin Pei Beis, where Ruvain was Makadesh and Isha Chutz Mi Shimon. So he left room, what's called Shir B'Kedusha for Shimon, B'Kiddush Shimon. So now she's married to both Ruvain and Shimon. Strange as that is, the halachic universe is very flexible, very open to possibilities. How could a woman be an Eish of two different people? And the answer is because the first one was Mishayar Chutz Mi Ploni, and now the Ploni was Mekadesh, so she's in effect married to both. And now, after Shimon was Mekadesh, the same woman that Reuven was Mekadesh, because Reuven's Kedusha was Chutz Mi Shimon. Now Shimon dies, and she falls for Yibum to Levi. So that's considered Eishes Shnei Mason. She has an Ishus relationship to two different people. And this is predicated on the assumption that there is such an entity, a halachic mechanism called Shir B'Kedusha. However, this particular Tana, the Tana that we call of Perek, he never accepted the halachic reality of Shir B'Kedusha. She can't, it's an all or nothing proposition. Either you're Mekadesh Nisha, Harayat Asur L'Kuli Almo, or you're not Mekadesh. But this Shir business where you're Mekudesh, but not to him, not vis-a-vis him, that doesn't exist in his radar screen. And therefore, there's no Mutsias of Eisha Shnei Mason. And this is all based on the principle of Ein Kedusha Tochs in the HSE. Now, in truth, the concept of Eisha Shnei Mason, as formulated by the Mishnah, has a drasha to it. The darshan from the Parsha of Yibum that only Eishes Meis Echad, but not Shnei Mason. But that drasha is only Nismach, according to this in Perek Dalarach. So now we're going to ask the question, so why is this D'Rabbanan, Gzeira D'Rabbanan institute? Why was it instituted? When we're talking about Gzeira D'Rabbanan, we're talking about, this again, Eisha Shnei Mason was Zika Shnei Yevamot and all. Why did it come into business? And in effect, in Maimar, we're going to have to come up with a whole new reason why the Baal HaMaimer Einam is Yabemis. We want to go the classic track of like a Zika from two different brothers, because now the Maimar creates a kind of Zika to the Baal HaMaimer, and that becomes rejected. You can't have a situation when each is to two different brothers, because on a Dorais level it doesn't exist. So Rabbanan are not going to create something that has no source in the Torah, so to imitate and mirror the Torah. So the answer here is where the Torah comes into play. And Gazru, they're afraid of, this is amazing, that im yiyabem as balas hamaymar, then yovel yabem gaves hatzorah shalom. The fear is that he might be miyabem both women. One woman he's going to be miyabem as a result of the brother who generated the maimar, but he's going to also be miyabem the tzara, because then he's going to go back to the original brother. So in effect, what he's doing is he's being miyabem two Yevamot from the same bias, and that's called nira adover kishet shteim mibayis echad v'yomu shtei Yevamos habos mibayis echad b'syavos. Now we know that two Yevamos that are projected to Yibum, from the same bias, you're only miyabim one of them. The other one gets nothing. He doesn't even need chalitza. But in this particular situation, because of the maimar, there's a chash that maybe he'll come to be miyabim mitzara, thinking that one yibum is not relevant to the other. One yibum is being protected by the original, the death of the original brother, the other by the maimar. And he's now being miyabim the tzara of someone who looks like shtei Yevamos habos mikol, or you don't even have to say that. Just say that he'll come to be miyabim two different Yevamots from one bias, based on the miscalculation in his mind. Umitam zeh afenu choletz. You might say, well, let him be miyabim one of them and be choletz the other one, and that covers all your bases. No, we're not going to allow that too, because if we allow chalitz, he might come to yibum. Because they're going to come to the conclusion that shtei Yevamos habos v'vaysecha is choltzin liachas v'yavim es hashniya. Ve'ol lios shekodem, he might switch the order around. He'll do chalitza to one of them, they'll be yavim the other one. And that's already Eishes Hach. Why? Because once the chalitza was done to one of the two, there's no yibum to the other one. And he's not allowed to be miyabim the second. Again, I'm not sure. Maybe we went too far by calling it Eishes Hach. It might be a din of kevet shalabana shuvlo yivna. In other words, the chalitza to one of them is chal vizvi all the yivamos. So if he goes ahead and he marries another one, it's like he's marrying his chalutza, which he can't do because of kevet shalabana shuvlo yivna. That law. Ba'ashme'ina tanahu es dino begadol. So gadol who did a maimar is eno misyabemes li'achiv. So now he's pointing out here that that perhaps there would be yibum to the Bala maimar, but not to any of the other Yevamot, any of the brothers. For who adin b'katav. Now we have the case of a bias benteisha Yevamot, and that's considered, according to Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, like Maimer begadol. And now, if he has another wife, and he dies, shtein cholzos v'lo misyab. So there won't be, again, both need chalitza because of the doraisa halacha. But on a Darbana level, we're not going to allow yibum to either of them. So that would mean that enochinami, according to, not our mission, but again, according to the Tana in Perik Dalad, we would really exclude yibum even from the tzara, even from Leah, as we called before. So even though the Tana in Perik Dalad spoke about the case of a gadol who did a maimer, he doesn't mention anything about a katan shebal yivimto. That's because the gadol koi, like this is a technical literary comment. The subject of that mission in Perik Dalad was maimer begadol. But the same din that applies to Maimer Gadol identically would apply to a Katan Bentation. Because his bia is that of a Maimer, and therefore Shtein Eino Misyabnos. Now our Mishnah says that the second wife of Shimon, Leah, is Misyabemes, they equated Bias Ben Teisha Gadol. But nevertheless, Leah is muteris liyibum. Why? V'lo gaza mishum tzara. Because at the time of Mishnah never accepted the gezerah of mishum tzara. And according to the Tan of Algish, the reason, the underlying Tam, that you're not allowed to be Miyabe, the Balas, now we're assuming it means one of the other brothers. That's not because of Xera, that he might come to be Miyabe the Tzara as well, and be Miyabe two Yevamos from Baisechad, but rather because he holds that there's a mitzias of Esha Shnei Mesim in Torah. In other words, we're going according to the Mandi Omar, who holds that there is Shir B'Kedushin. And in the case of Esha Shnei Mesim, where in effect she was married to two brothers because of the Shir business, now we have a drasha, and this is a full-fledged drasha, of Esha Shnei below Esha Shnei Mesim. Now, the Rabbanan, since they knew on a Deraisa level that there is such an entity which the Torah prohibits of the Eshish Mason, they made a Xera in the case of a Balas HaMaimar, she received Maimar, that she should not lend herself to Yibum, because on a Rabbanan level, she's considered like Eshish Mason. Because again, the Maimar creates an Ishus, and then there's the previous husband, the brother, who died. So she's like an Eshish. That if we allow Yibum in this case, then of a Balas Maimar, then we'll mistakenly come to the conclusion that you could allow Yibum of an Eshish Mason, because she looks exactly like an Eshish Mason. Oh, but that's not going to cover the Tzara. Why? According to this logic, the Isha herself, She'asaba Maimar, or for that matter, She'boleh Katan Ventesha, because his status is equal to Maimar, she's prohibited from Yibum because she has a Zika of Shnei Yevamot, of the original brother and the Baal HaMaimar, or the Katan Ventesha. In our case, Aval Tzarasa Mutesus Yamen, Kevan She'ein Siboli Osra. Now, what does that mean, Ein Siboli Osra? He says in the name of the Rosh that Eshish Shnei Mason Eino Iser Kol Kach Chamur Shenesa Gab Zika Shnei Yevamim Shemidrabanon Shene'esar, we will prohibit, even in the case of Shnei Zikos, different Yevamim, the Zikos are the Rabbanon, double the Zikos, that Maimar, which the Rabbanon, or the expectations of Rabbanon. So that's not strong enough that we should prohibit the Tzara Lucia. Yashmina V'Katan, who didn't be Gadol. In other words, the Mishnah could have spoken about a Gadol who does a Maimar in the Tzara, let's say. I'm sorry, not in the Tzara. I mean in the first woman. That's called a Rachel. Again, there's no difference between Bias Bentesha in Rachel or Maimar in Rachel, but Haidikama B'Kata under B'Kata. Here the Mishnah is addressing the laws of B'Kata. So basically what we're saying is, in sum, is that there's no difference between Bias Bentesha and Maimar B'Gadol. The Tan of our Mishnah holds that even in the case of a Gadol who does a Maimar and he has another wife, if he dies, then his tzara is muteres l'siyab. And that's against the Tana of the Mishnah in Perek Daled Achim, who holds that the tzara is asura. And again, this machlokus boils down to the reasoning why we prohibit yibum in the case of the Balas HaMaimar. Is it because it's considered like Eshish Shnei Mason, and that far we're not going to go to Asa the Tzara, and that's the Tana of our Mishnah, or it's a Xera because he might come to be Miyabim also the Tzara, and he's Miyabim two Yevamas from Bayis Ech. And since the Midrabanan Maimar is Kona, and for that matter, Bias Bentesha, it looks like there is Shtei Yevamas coming from Bayis Ech, as if these two Yevamas are coming from Shimon, when in reality, they're coming from two different brothers. So because of this Gezerah, Shemiyomru Shtei Yevamas Bayis Ech Misyamos, or they'll say that there'll be a chalitza to one and be even to the another one, which will create an isur kevin to a and therefore we should prohibit even the tzara, and that's the sheet of the Tana of Perik Dalanach. Now the Gemara tells us a story that happened during a public learning session. Lazal Rabbi Lazar the Amal Shmaita Bei Midrash. So Rabbi Lazar said over this entire sugya of Abias ben Katan Kimayim Begadol, about which we said that, according to Tanav Amish at least, even in the case of Gadol Shasba Maimar, the tzara is misyabenes. She's allowed for evil. There was no gzera to prohibit the tzara. And this is what he publicly said. But Lo Amar Mishmeid Rabbi Yochanan. He didn't say it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And Shomer Rabbi Yochanan ve'ik. Rabbi Yochanan was mad. Why didn't you say it in my name? And it would seem that Rabbi Lazar, as a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan, would be sliding his Rebbe if he said over Allah without mentioning that he heard it from his Rebbe. So Ul Gabe, Rabbi Ami, Rav Asi, they wanted to be Mafayes Rabbi Yochanan, the Amrulei, and they said to him, Lo kacha yamaisa bebeis haknet shel Tveria. There was a diun of Tanoim back in the day in the shul in Tveria, ben neger, sheyesh berosho glustera, and the issue here is a Shabbos issue. So you have, let's say, a door, and the door has a bolt, which is called a neger. It's like a round bolt. And no, I'm sorry, the round bolt is the glustera. The locks the door down is called a neger, and it somehow links the mashkov of the door when you lock it with this neger. It has on it a glustera. Okay, now a glustera is a kli. It's roy l'shimush. And nechleku bo Rabbi Lazar Yossi. Are you allowed to be tochev on Shabbos into the hole in the mashkov, this neger, in order to lock the door? And Rabbi Lazar was machmir. He said that it looks like he's being misakin, like a tolda of meleches. Rabbi Yossi holds that since it has a glustera attached to it, and the glustera itself is royal shimush, therefore it's considered a kli, and you're allowed to move it and lock the door. Ad shekaru sefer Torah b'chamosa. There was a battle here, a controversy between the Tanoim, Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yossi, till it got to the point where each one grabbed onto a Sefer Torah, tried to prove his point, and they ripped the Sefer Torah in their anger. So now at this point, the Gemara sort of takes a little bit of a digression in the middle of this discussion of Rabbi Ami and Rav Asi, and the Gemara asks, Karu salkedaitach ema shenikra sefer Torah b'chamos. No, it wasn't that they ripped the sefer Torah b'chavano, be a dime, but rather in the anger here that there was such a heated up debate and a controversy that it caused that the sefer Torah should be ripped. So now we go back to the words of Rabbi Ami and Rav Asi to Rabbi Yochanan. V'hoishom Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma. When this Sefer Torah was ripped, Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma was Omar, Mi ani im lo yeh beis knesset zu makom lavodas kochavim. And as they came to such anger, and as a result of this anger, they ripped the Sefer Torah. And anger, kas, is dochek ragli shchina mi beis haknesses. And if you remove the shchina because kolakois kilu ein shchina kedegla. You remove the shchina from Beis HaKnesset, it now becomes exposed to great dangers. V'kach hava, kein hava. That after a certain period of time, that Beis Knesset became a mokol avodah zarah. So what Rabbi Ami and Rav Asi, by implication, are telling Rabbi Yochanan is that anger is a very dangerous thing, and it could bring a takola. So please, don't get angry. Hodar ikvad fe. Rabbi Yochanan's kpeda against Rabbi Lazar was increased. In other words, it boomeranged, the exact opposite. Yeah. Omar chevrusa nami. Rabbi Yochanan turns to Rabbi Ami and Rav Asi, and he says, "Ha'im haneches sha'osim es Rabbi Lazar kechaver shali." Are you comparing Rabbi Lazar to a colleague of mine? Do you bring a raya from Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yossi, who were chaverim, they were colleagues, and they should not have gotten angry one on the other. But when it comes to a Rebbe has a right and maybe should get angry as his Talmud when his Talmud crosses the line. Ola Gabe Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. So Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi goes to see Rabbi Yochanan and try to be Mephayesim. Amalei, so Rabbi Yaakov quotes a pasuk. And this pasuk is in Sefer Yoshua. Kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe avdo, kain tziva Moshe es Yoshua, v'chein asi Yoshua lo. So this pasuk signifies that whatever Yeshua did was mipi Moshe. He got it from Moshe as a command. So the question is, v'chial kol davar sha'omer Yoshua ya'omer le'em kach amali Moshe. Are you going to tell me that every time Yeshua opened his mouth and made a statement, he said, well, this is what I heard from Moshe. Yoshua Yoshe v'dorish stam. Yoshua didn't have to be explicitly quoting his Rebbe Moshe. Hakol yodu shetaraso shel Moshe. Af Rabbi Lazar, Talmidcha, Yoshe v'dorish stam. Your Talmud Rabbi Lazar darshans that he teaches without mentioning any name. But Hakol yodim kishal chai. Everyone knows that he's just transmitting your Torah. And at that point, Nispayis Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan, Omar he turns to Rabbi Ami Rav Asi Midnei Iatem Yodim Lefayes, Kimo Ben Idi Chaviredu, like Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Idi. Why don't you know the method of use? So Gemara asked Rabbi Yochanan, my time a couple high. Why did Rabbi Yochanan make such a big deal about this? Just because his Talmud Rabbi Lazar did not mention his name. My answer is the Omer of Yehuda Marav. My Siv, what does it mean? David Melch and Tilim, Agura bi Olcha Olamim. It sounds like David is Mavakesh, that he should live in two worlds, Olamim in plural. There's no such mitzvah that a person can live in two worlds. Ella, Amar David Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ono Shel Olam. And here we turn to Daf Sadi Zayin Omer Aleph. He wrote on Sheyomru Dvar Shmua Mipi Ba'olam Hazeh. May it be His will that halacha should be said in my name after I die. And then it's considered, says David HaMelech, as if I live in two different worlds. Why is that? Meaning Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. The Omer Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai called Talmud Chach Shomer Dvar Shmua Mipi Ba'olam Hazeh Sifsoso Dovros Bakever. His lips are moving, so to speak, in his burial place, like metaphorically. So whenever you say over halacha in his name, then he's living in two worlds, because his neshama is in the yeshiva shel mala, but his sifsoso, his lips are moving in the kever down here in Olam Hazeh. And that's how important it is to say over something in the name of someone. Omar Rabbi Yitzchak ben Zera, V'itema Shimon Nazira. Micro, what's the possible source? As if so Dovros Bekever. Shenemar, because it says in Shir Hashirim, V'chikech kiyein hatov holech l'dodil v'shamim dover sifsei yeshenim. So what is v'chichech? That's referring to the Torah. The pasuk is all about a moshel between yayin and Torah. And just like yayin is dovev, right? It bubbles. So too Torah is dovev. It gives the sifsei yeshenim, which is mentioned explicitly, a dovev, meaning to move. Kikomer shel anov. This is what happens to a comer. A comer here is a kli, it's a vessel, and they put the grapes inside of it, and the grapes become warm. And then the yayin starts very quickly coming out of the grapes. And right, as soon as you touch it, the yayin starts bubbling and it goes out. Because again, the anovim at this point are very soft. And all you need is just to touch on them, and the yayin starts oozing out of these grapes. Af Talmidei Chachamim and Nimshal, they too, Kevan Sha'omrim Darshu Mipim Bol Mazesib, so say him Dovros Bekever. That's why Rabbi Yochanan would say, this is where we'll stop.